welcome to the Ultra Running Sam podcast. So quickly, our sponsors. We are proudly sponsored by Ugoku caps. You've seen me wearing them on the podcast. You can get the discount codes from me, send me a message. I'll send them to you. They're floating around. We're also sponsored by Phoenix head torches. Same thing goes. If you're after a discount code, just get in touch. There are there on the web, but if you want them personally from me, I will send them to you. And also, finally, we are proudly sponsored by Home Trails. So Home Trails is my YouTube series interviewing famous trail runners from hopefully around the world at some point. In the UK at the moment, where we interview them on the trail in the home trails. You understand what it is, don't you? If you listen to the show. That's hopefully turning into a bit of a brand, so keep your eyes peeled for that. Okay, on with the actual show. Okay, we're live. So, welcome to the Ultra Running Sam podcast. I'm going to get your name wrong. Finn Melanson.
You got it perfect. Finn Melanson. Yeah.
Finn Melanson. Yeah. So I was just sort of saying before we hit record that it's all new to me. We're using your system for recording, Riverside. So this is a bit of an advert for them that they didn't know they were going to get. So I'll bear with it. It seems to be working pretty good. So, and you've almost convinced me that I need to switch over to it. So, yeah, well, welcome. Anyway, I'll stop talking now, blabbering on about nonsense. Welcome to the Ultra Running Sam podcast, Finn.
Sam, it's a pleasure to be here. I've listened to a few episodes. I was telling you offline that I really enjoyed the conversation that you had with Ryan Thrower, and just scrolling through the catalog, the Dragon's Back, the Spine. I was telling you offline, I probably have more questions for you than you do for me. I find the UK ultra running scene to be fascinating. So excited to see where this one goes today.
Yeah. I kind of envision this as kind of being like the two worlds colliding, kind of the US trail running media landscape and the UK trail running world. So I'm kind of, you've probably got as many questions, like you say, for me about what goes on over here as I have for you over there. But we'll begin with you, if that's okay. So obviously, anyone who comes on my podcast, I know you have questions that you always ask your guests and stuff, but my opening question is always the superhero question. So people that listen to the podcast will sort of be familiar with the superhero question. So I sort of propose that all of us as trail runners and ultra runners, we're basically superheroes. If you're an ultra runner, you're a superhero. So all superheroes have an origin story or a backstory of how they became that superhero. Obviously, you get prequels and stuff of how they became that superhero. So Finn, what is your superhero backstory? What's your origin story? How did you go from normal human being Finn to being Finn that everybody knows for the Singletrack podcast and everything that you do related to trail running media?
Well, first of all, I love the premise of that question because I subscribe to an author. His name is Joseph Campbell, and he wrote extensively about the hero's journey. And one of his strongly held beliefs was that, like you said, everyone really is a superhero. And if you really diagnose it, everyone has had some sort of hero's journey in their life where they're confronted with some challenge. They go through the belly of the beast. They're able to ultimately triumph. And then once they triumph and they're sort of returning home, they bring some nugget of wisdom back to the masses. And yeah, I like the accessibility of how you framed it. And it kind of reminded me of that. My journey, I was not a runner. I didn't start trail running until I was 25, 26 years old. So relative late bloomer. Like I'm not somebody that comes from a high school, college, cross-country track background. I don't have that pedigree. I do have the benefit of a couple things. One, I was a latchkey kid. Both my parents worked and they were pretty laissez-faire about how I grew up. I spent a lot of time outdoors, I was not called home until dinner was on the table. So there was a lot of freedom, a lot of curiosity. If I wanted anything in life, going to the store to pick up baseball cards or whatever, it was kind of incumbent on me to figure out the intricacies of public transportation or how many miles or kilometers it took to walk there. So there were some like ultra running DNA aspects in upbringing that I could point to that would be like, okay, those things happened, and that's kind of why I'm at where I'm at today. But it didn't really come to fruition until 2014. I graduated from college and literally took my last final, hopped a flight down to a place here in the US called Atlanta, Georgia, and started hiking the Appalachian Trail.
Right.
And that totally revolutionized my worldview. I just realized how much I appreciated nature and how much happiness I could find in simplicity. The idea of walking for long stretches, needing to find shelter at night, making sure that I was getting in enough calories, it shocked me that those three pieces could bring so much joy to my life. And then you layer on top of that the fact that there were other people out there, and it was actually much more a social experience than this like man or woman or person versus wilderness type thing that I had been kind of imagining it would be. And, you just realize that there's this whole class of people out there in the world that do this thing for joy and for profession. And I'm the type of person who, if I come across something that I think is special, I invest pretty heavily into it. At the very least, I'm very curious, and you just chase the rabbit hole. And so, it's 2024, almost 2025 now, and I'm deep in it, and I have no regrets. And I felt like from a vocation standpoint, lifestyle standpoint, I was fortunate to make a good decision.
Mm. Yeah. So when you sort of had that experience on the Appalachian Trail, and you decided that this was the sort of world that you wanted to be in, had you sort of imagined that it would lead to where you are now with the Singletrack podcast, and you've got a lot of sort of notoriety and respect in the trail running media world, haven't you? So how did that sort of journey sort of take you to that point where you thought, I've got to start a podcast? Was it at the point where everyone was like, in lockdown, I've got to start a podcast for something to do?
Gosh, this is such a good question. And my wife, when she listens to this, she will laugh because she knows I am not someone that is capable of visualization or really planning too many steps into the future. I am someone that kind of operates very confidently for whatever reason. It's probably a part of my DNA. I operate very confidently on blind faith, and I trust intuition, and I trust interest. And all of this began, like you just look at the podcast, for example. We actually talked about this offline. I was looking for an excuse to have conversations with people that I found fascinating, that I wanted to learn more about. And like I had listened to every single episode that, Dylan Bowman had ever been on, or Courtney DeWalter, or, Jamil Curry, or, Jasmine Paris. And like, I still had questions. And so I was just like, look, I'm so fascinated. It's probably awkward to just reach out and see if they'll hop on a phone call that is of no more value than for me to satisfy my curiosity. And thankfully, we have this technology that is podcasting, where it's really, especially when you're starting out, it's just an excuse to meet the person. It's there's no audience metrics attached or social media fanfare, at least for the guest. I think every day how grateful I am for someone like Dylan, who I think he was our first guest. And I had no business talking to him because he's got 18 balls in the air and he's got a lot of requests for content coming his way. But he was super gracious, and like I think as soon as you get those small little bits of validation in your show, more people are willing to kind of come on. It's sort of just the social aspect of our human nature. And yeah, but there was no plan. And there, in some respects, like if you talk to me today in 2024, I'm just grateful that this has become a lifestyle business where it can pay the bills and put food on the table. I have no idea where it's heading. There's a band here in the US, you might know that. I'm super into music. There's a famous band, the Grateful Dead, and their lead singer, a guy named Jerry Garcia. And people would always ask him about his career decisions. And he would always just say, I wake up every single day and basically I count my lucky stars that I am able to survive in this world playing music, playing my guitar. That's all I ever want, and I don't take it for granted. I'm waking up every single day assuming that tomorrow it could fall apart. And that's kind of how I feel about this too. Like, I'm in it for the ride right now, but I'm under no sense of delusion that, it's going to exist even a year or two from now. I certainly hope it does, but I don't hold this attachment to it because I understand that life is crazy.
Yeah, they say, don't they, never meet your idols, but in podcasting, that's exactly what you do, isn't it? You get to virtually or in person, meet your idols. And I wanted to talk to you about that because you mentioned Debo, and I think that I'm, if you're sort of obsessed with everything that Debo puts out, I'm probably on a level with that as well. The fact that I view him as a bit of a, when I interviewed him after he came second at Hard Rock, wasn't it? Came second at. I sort of said to him that I feel like he's got a bit of a crystal ball for what happens in trail running. Like he seems to sort of, he almost manifests things that sort of come to fruition. He has all these like ideas, and he always seems to be on the cutting edge of what's happening. And it made me laugh when I went back and listened to your very first podcast. So you did like a bit of a preview podcast where it was only like 45 seconds, wasn't it? Where you laid out, you probably don't even remember doing it, where you laid out your sort of mission quest of what the podcast was going to be. And then your very first interview was with Debo. And it was when he was in his pillars phase. So
yes, yeah.
I said to him, when I interviewed him, I said, there's probably not many people that have been with you since it was The Well to begin with, wasn't it? The Well, that was his first, that was the first podcast, The Well. Yep. Then he changed it to Pillars and had all those crazy coaching ideas and everything that he obviously sort of abandoned or moved to one side. And then obviously he moved on to Free Trail and everything, all the amazing things that's done. So do you feel like that he seems to have his finger on the and I know that he sort of quotes you as saying that your podcast is one that he sort of goes to for information, but do you I don't want this to turn into like a bit of a love-in for Debo, but
we can take it whatever direction you want.
is the sort of thing that him and Ryan have done with, and Harmony have done with Free Trail, do you view that as sort of inspiring to you?
I mean, there's a lot of stuff to be inspired about there. I think a couple of things when I think of Debo, obviously he's a great tastemaker. So you just think about what he puts his finger on and what he deems important. And I think there's a lot of thoughtfulness that goes into it. And he has so much experience as a consumer of media himself, as a fan of sports, and having this really long history in the sport of ultra running. He's kind of been in the scene since I want to say like 08 or 09. He's seen so many iterations of the sport take place and generations of the sport take place that he's really a great tastemaker. You mentioned sort of the evolution from the Well to Pillars to Free Trail. And to me, that's a great sign of fluidity and open-mindedness and stubbornness in the right ways. Like, he cares about the sport. He believes, rightfully so, that he has meaningful contributions to make and that he's directionally correct. So maybe like a particular business model, after all, doesn't make sense, but he knows that he's in the right space and he's going to continue that process of seeking out where the right fit is. And I really admire that because, business is very tough and it's hard to nail it on the first time. If you look at a lot of successful founders out there, they are typically on their 7th or 8th or even 9th business before they kind of strike it and find their sort of niche. So yeah, it's been really fun to follow their journey. And, if you even listen to his companion podcast, Their Second Nature, him and co-host Aaron Lutzy, they're really forthcoming about sort of what they're dealing with and just the humanity of their experience. Like, yeah, there's been some great wins, there's been some setbacks, but we're still in it. And I love that they're willing to relay that too, because I'm sure you feel the same way as a podcast host. It's great to have that sense of affirmation that it's tough for everyone. And if you have any doubt in the process, or you want to shut things down, or you just have the crises of faith that it's all normal. So yeah, in addition to just Debo putting out great content and tuning in for a lot of their trail getting stuff, which is I'd say what I'm probably the biggest fan of, and their fantasy free trail platform and whatnot. Yeah. It's cool to see that aspect to it.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it? So another one of the episodes that I listened to was I went back and listened to the episode with Eric Trans, and that was obviously a new one. So
you were back in the cat. You went so far back. This is awesome.
Because I wanted to see
I'm sorry.
what I wanted to sort of talk to you about is how the trail and ultra running media landscape has changed. So going back and listening to that podcast, to me, listening to it now, it felt, no disrespect to your podcasting skills or anything, it felt a bit dated. And not because...
Sure.
Do you know what I mean by that? And that was because
No, please go.
Yeah, go I absolutely loved Ultra Runner podcast. That was like, I listened to that for years, and he was the thing that one of the sort of inspirations for me for starting, because I was like, I want to be the Ultra Running podcast of the UK. So the way that he has the most amazing guests on all the time. But what he in that episode, you probably don't remember what he talked about, but he sort of resisted all the talk about technology coming into trail and ultra running. So he was talking about shoes and stuff like that, and it was almost like it was a snapshot of that sort of time period in the sport, of where people were still sort of, trail running is like a social thing. It's people are winning races, but people aren't being paid big contracts. It's people are doing it for the love of the sport, sort of thing. But now, obviously, that has changed. When you talk about like David Roach, who literally pulls on every single lever that he can to win a race and set records and stuff. How do you do you feel that there's been a sort of a shift in the landscape of trail running media over the years? Because it is getting more and more in depth, more coverage, and quite rightly, there's more money coming into the sport, which obviously brings its own problems with stuff with UTMB and things like that, where people disagree about that more money coming into the sport isn't great. It will bring people in that will possibly cheat. How do you feel about the changing landscape of ultra running? And I know that's a big question.
Yeah. So my thoughts have evolved here. When I was more uninformed about the history of media in our sport, and I was just coming up myself, I just had this blanket assumption that whatever was current was a step function better than what had previously existed. But now when I go back in the catalogs of these things, yes, I grant to you that the current content today is perhaps more polished and converted better to various social platforms like YouTube and Instagram. I will grant you all that. But at least in the American scene, when I go back and I look at what I Run Far was doing, to a large extent what Eric Schranz was doing, even JB and Jen Benna, they had that ultra live outfit going on. And there was, I want to say it was Rob Goyen, I can't think of his name, but he also had some sort of like live stream, live coverage, pre-post race stuff going on. A lot of the stuff that we are polishing today did exist, granted in a more primitive form back then, but it's not like what we're doing now is totally brand new and necessarily better from a conversational standpoint. So that was a very humbling experience for me. And it makes me way more appreciative of sort of the people that came before. And I now sort of come to the conclusion that maybe instead of being too worried about the past or the future, because obviously you're probably, because of the opportunities and the resources you have, you're probably going to be in a better position than the past. But also, the current is going to get innovated out by the future. So I think where I find peace is you have to bring a willingness to be a contributor to, let's call it, the evolutionary chain of your crafter community. I am operating right now with Singletrack podcast under the full assumption that there's going to be some podcast host or media outlet that is going to come 2 or 3 years from now, 5, 10 years from now, and they're going to make Singletrack and Free Trail and I Run Far, Outside Magazine, anyone in the UK like yourself on the European continent, they're going to put us to shame. Their stuff is going to be so much better because they have had the opportunity to look back at history and see the Eric Trans era and the I Run Far era, the current era. Like, I just think we have to be accepting of that. And our only job is to do the best we can with the resources we have and hopefully be a stepping stone.
Yes, standing on the shoulders of giants. That's what they say, isn't it? That's the saying. Yeah.
Like, I thought Ian Corliss was doing a great job. I don't know where his content has gone, but like, you know, I was listening to Talk Ultra and Ian Corliss, and he would have like those segments where like Carl Meltzer would come on and Eric Trans was doing some cool stuff. And I'm not sure that their content was any worse than the current stuff. It just might be the production value and the polishing of it all. But like, we've had great people in the space now for years.
Yeah, and I was absolutely gutted when he stopped doing that podcast. Have you had any contact with him since to sort of pick his brain about? Because I think at the time, when he was winding it up, I was sort of just starting out, and I messaged him, and I said, you know, would you come on and talk about ultra running? And but you know, obviously I knew that he loves paddleboarding, and I'm a bit obsessed with paddleboarding as well in the summer months. So I was like, right, we can have a conversation. We can talk about ultra running, but we can also talk about paddleboarding. And he was like, yeah, I'm really up for that, but not that bothered about talking about ultra running. And he sort of kind of said that he sort of didn't agree with the way that the sport was going, but I never really, because the interview never happened, I never got a chance to sort of pin him down on what he actually meant by that. So have you sort of spoken to him since he exited the podcasting world?
I haven't, and that's not to say it's because of a lack of interest. I think anybody that has a history in the sport, especially as substantial as Eric's, I would love to continue the conversation. I do think it's human nature to lament where your given profession or community is going. I think if you I read something on the internet a year or two ago, and it was just pointing out that this is timeless, where the older generation will always be frustrated with the generation right behind it. Like, if you even go back to prehistoric times, there's writings like on petroglyphs or whatever the term is, showing like an older person in the community being like, this next generation is totally lost. Like, where are they going? So, you know, if you look at maybe the comments from Eric, I don't think they're particular to Eric. I think they are just representative of just human nature, right? Like, when I have no doubt that when I ultimately leave the trail running community, in some way, shape, or form, I'm going to be pointing my finger or, you know, wagging my fist or whatever and saying, this, and this is crazy, you know? And you know what? That's actually probably a sign that it's time for me to go. Like, I am no longer relevant, and which is fine. I think you have to be comfortable with your mortality, comfortable with where and when you can provide meaningful contributions to your space. And so I have always thought that, again, this is not something to put on any particular person, but I've always thought it's just human nature that those types of comments and perspectives are more reflective of you needing to exit your space than anything that's truly going wrong, I think, with where you're operating. But also, I should say this, and maybe you feel the same way, putting out content is a grind. Like, you are signing up for a pretty crazy Sisyphusian treadmill type existence where every single week someone's expecting a long form interview or an Instagram reel or whatever. And it's a grind. And so I have nothing but respect for people like Eric, because he did it with love and joy for, I mean, I think it ended up being 12 years. And I'm only on year 3. And it's really hard for me to fathom doing this for another 9 years. I mean, maybe I will, because I'll still love it. But oh my gosh, the days and the months tick by pretty slowly when you're on this treadmill. So at the bottom line, I salute Eric. And, you know, if he was jaded at the end, like, you know, all the power to him, because I'll probably be jaded too.
So how do you plan to stay relevant as long as possible? If you like you say, you know, thinking about in the future, do you think the sport will change so much that you will sort of feel like you're not relevant anymore? Because what you do is sort of integral to the US scene, isn't it? So you're sort of first line interviewing people after races, you're doing stuff connected before races, you're doing previews of races. Do you feel like you will have to evolve with the scene to stay relevant?
I would challenge the question, because I don't feel like I need to stay. I shouldn't need to stay relevant. I should only be relevant as long as I'm contributing something meaningful to the community. And as soon as I stop making those contributions, my ticket's expired. I really do chafe at the idea that because I've done XYZ, I deserve to have a seat at the table, or I deserve for people to tune in. I produce every single episode with the expectation that I am reproving myself to the audience, and that I am there at their discretion. Like I really treat that relationship dearly. And if I ever take it for granted, haven't yet, that's another sign that I need to go. But yeah, I think it's a great question. I would just say, like, philosophically, the idea of staying relevant sounds weird, because it sounds like I'm grasping at straws, or because I'm power hungry or attention hungry, I'm looking for an excuse for people to tune in. And if I ever get to that point, that's when someone needs to, like, arrest me or throw me out the door, because I think that's a miserable way to go about life.
Yeah, true. So you've been podcasting for 3 years now then. So how have you sort of, with your involvement in the scene, how have you seen it changed? Have you noticed a shift in any way with the physical sport, not so much the media side of things, but the way that the sport is sort of known to the world now?
I think one of the really cool developments, and it's probably not totally new to talk about this, but I think it's still important to repeat. A few years ago, we started publishing conversations with athlete managers at various brands, trying to uncover how that whole relationship works between athlete and athlete manager, athlete and brand, how contracts work, how deliverables work, how much people get paid. And it was a pretty basic type of conversation, but I'm proud of it in the sense that it inspired people that were way more qualified than me, people that had way more experience, to take that conversation even further. There's a conversation that I reference all the time because I think it's so good. Aaron Lutzy and Dylan Bowman recorded a show sort of on this topic a year ago, and then they republished the episode maybe a week or two ago because it's so relevant. It's sort of one of those evergreen conversations, getting way more into detail about this. Aaron having been an athlete manager at Red Bull, Dylan having been a sponsored athlete, and now negotiating contracts for his media company currently. It's a very fruitful conversation. And that's just one example, but you're just seeing now a level of openness to talk about these types of things in the media and also among athletes. And I think it's only going to lead to a more positive outcome, where hopefully athletes are making more money. Hopefully they're better protected. Hopefully there's a willingness to maybe like reduce the scope of NDAs so that there can just be more transparency in the process. Hopefully athlete managers are more equipped. And again, I want to preface this all by saying there's a lot that I don't know. And part of the reason why I started this podcast is because I wanted to create my own historical exploration for our community. And I'm sure if you went through the grapevine and you looked at like the Ultra Runner podcast library or Talk Ultra, you'd find some select episodes on these topics. But it felt like as soon as we started publishing that stuff, the floodgates opened even further. And if we never do anything else again, I'm glad that like through our naivety in wanting to have these conversations, we helped create something there.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, actually, because I've had this conversation. I think I spoke to Debo about this, about, money coming into the sport and what people are paid, whether, the professionalization of trail running and ultra running. People have gone from traditionally sort of doing it on the side, having a full-time job or a part-time job, and and running and winning races, and going into work on a Monday morning and telling people that they've won this race that in the ultra running world is like a big deal, but in the work life world they're like big deal sort of thing. But that sort of changed, doesn't it? As money is sort of big brands are spending money on people now, and I think that's something I want, like you, to sort of develop so that it gets to the point where, why shouldn't, amazing trail runners be paid the same as like professional footballers? I say footballers, so soccer players over here. So I'll use that sort of analogy, that all of the big like Premier League football teams, soccer teams over here, if a significant player moves to another team, everybody knows how much he was sold for and how much, what bonus he's getting, how much money he's being paid every week. And obviously everyone's like, I can't believe he's being paid like that much money a week. But it's accepted in that sport for people to know exactly how much they're earning a week for the thing that they do. So why shouldn't the people that we sort of, not idolise, but the people that we appreciate in our sport, I wouldn't care if I knew how much Jim Walmsley was earning every year, like through his sponsors. It wouldn't make me sort of feel bitter towards him to know that he was on £1 million contract and he was getting X amount of thousands for showing up to races and things like that. You just think that's great for him. Do you think that it'll get to that point in the sport where we know exactly how much people are being paid for what?
Gosh, there's just so many variables that would have to come into play. I think you'd have to see some sort of players union. I know we have the Professional Trail Runners Association, but you would need to have some sort of union come together and sort of like collective bargaining agreement for, I think, transparency to take place. And because there's so many individual brands in the market, it would be hard to see how any necessary consolidation would happen for a meaningful relationship to exist collectively between the industry and the athletes. I'm sure you might be able to see some one-off ones where it's like Adidas versus that, but I just think to me, I'm not hopeful anytime in the future, just because the whole process right now is so scattered and convoluted. But one thing that I will say, and you kind of reminded me of it, it's more philosophical. I think there was a concern 2 or 3 years ago, and it's part of why things were kind of kept under wraps. There was a concern that if you started to talk about brass tacks and economics of our sport, you would see an over commercialization happen. And there's no question that we're seeing a professionalization of the sport. But I would also say to people that are worried about a sea change of culture happening, that while all this is happening, while players are making more money, while the sport is professionalizing, we're also seeing great art happen. You just had Ryan Thrower on the podcast. I think of people like Courtney White, Mike McMonigal, all of these amazing videographers and photographers that are making such great art and content that we have never seen before. That's alive and well. The cultural aspect is alive and well. FKTs have never been more popular. Personal projects have never been more popular. So everything can coexist. You can have the UTMB world, the Western States world, and that whole money pot, but you can also have people that are still doing it for the love of the game and without fanfare and credentials. Like the lifestyle, culture, community aspect of it, I would argue, has never been more alive and well. So none of this stuff is mutually exclusive. Just because we're talking more about money now doesn't mean we're going to have to make this crazy deal with the devil trade-off where the parts of it that we loved, like Anton Krupicka running around barefoot, no shirt on with maybe a water bottle, like that doesn't exit stage left because of this new development. It's just all we're doing is creating a more well-rounded, richer collective conversation.
Yeah, I agree. But also going back to the football, the soccer analogy, sort of that. There are different tiers of teams. So like you have got like Premier League teams where they're all paid a massive amount of money. Then you've got like lower division teams. And it could almost be like the big brands are like if you know anything about English football. I'm not a massive football fan, by the way. I support Nottingham Forest, which is my family team. So from Nottingham, but it's understood that big teams, big massive teams, they pay big money, and then smaller teams, more local teams pay less. But there's no shame in like playing for a lower division team and earning, like £1,000 a week, or go into a Premier League team and earning, hundreds of thousands a week. Could it be that like the brands are like, your Hokers are like the Manchester Uniteds of the world? Your Adidas are like another, like Liverpool, that kind of thing, that they could all coexist and be paid different amounts of money and everyone would be okay with it.
Again, to me, the challenge there is the Ultras and the Hokas and the Brooks aren't beholden to this larger entity. In this case, it would be some sort of league or association. Like all of these brands are operating independent of each other, and so until there's this larger organizing principle, like you mentioned, like the Premier League, that everyone is beholden to, like the structure of it. I guess the equivalent would be like if all the brands somehow operated under the auspices of the UTMB World Series, and that had more collective power in the sport, or the Skyrunner World Series, or the Golden Trail Series. But even then, that's a Salomon outfit. Like, it's just, things are so dispersed right now organizationally that I still struggle to see how you would find the buy-in necessary for all this to come together. It's really tough.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I'll stop talking money now. What, talking about like UTMB and everything, so what's your sort of opinions on that, if you have any strong opinions? Because I know there was they've done quite a few things that have upset people over the last few years, well, for quite a few years. And if you like me as a podcaster, you have to stay neutral to these kind of things, don't you? So you can see both sides of the equation. And I sort of, when the whole thing with Wham kicked off in Whistler and everything, all that to do with them allegedly over, taking Gary Robbins' race away and things like that. I actually interviewed a guy, I can't remember the names now, they've gone out of my head. But I interviewed like the head of global trail running for UTMB, and then one of the guys who was connected with Ironman in Whistler. And I sort of, at the time when it was all kicking off on social media, where there was, it was like a storm basically going on and they were getting abuse from every angle, I just sent them a DM and just said, how would you feel about coming on my podcast and talking about your side of things? Because we're hearing everything stateside. Would you come on and speak to my listeners about your point of view? And I didn't expect any reply at all. I just thought it would be a DM that would be lost sort of in the ether. But I had like an email come back, and the PR department were like, yeah, we'd like to set this up and come on your podcast. And they came on. And by the end of it, I could see their side of things. But at the same time, there was things that I felt like they needed to work on. And obviously that's like an ongoing thing for them. But how do you feel about, people have accused them of sort of like storming into places and taking over races and trying to stamp their, the UTMB trademark all over everything. They are buying races, they are taking over races. But do you feel that this is just the natural progression of the sport, and as it gets more professionalized, that these things will, it's just like a natural progression of the sport, money coming in, races getting bigger? What are your thoughts on that?
I have many thoughts. The first thing I should say is I want to commend you, because I believe this might actually have been how I was introduced to your podcast, but I believe you were the first podcast to reach out and connect and have a conversation on, at the time, what was an extremely divisive, thorny issue. And I thought you navigated it well. Okay. And I listened to Paul Huddle and Keith Monagle.
Glad you knew that.
I thought it was really well done.
Glad you knew that.
Yeah. And so I think I really want to just first salute you, because I think you set off a great trend there in airing grievances and just having a fair conversation and yeah, at least setting the table for what was to come. Later on down the line, I want to say it was in like February or March, we had Paul Huddle on to kind of have a follow-up conversation to what you discussed. And there's a lot here. I mean, I think the first thing I want to say is I think when anyone gets big, whether it's a person or a race or a company or a country, it's inevitable that some sort of major conflict is going to arise. There's drama is going to arise. That's just the nature of scale. It's the nature of bigness. It's the nature of all sorts of disparate entities and interests and people coming together and trying to live in harmony. Like, things happen, conflicts happen. And I do think part of the issues that we saw envelop last year are just the function of something in our sport getting pretty darn big and us having the growing pains of figuring out how to resolve the issues associated. And so a couple things come to mind. UTMB, prior to a couple years ago, did not have a good pregnancy policy or a pregnancy policy at all. And now, thanks to the lobbying of the PTRA and the open-mindedness of the Palettis and the UTMB team, there is this awesome pregnancy deferral policy. I believe for a long time there were issues with prize money at the race and just general issues that elite runners had with how they were being treated by a race that profited mightily off of their performances. Since then, I believe UTMB has made at least some adjustments when it comes to prize money and maybe other accommodations that make it easier to be a pro at this race. So right off the bat, I want to acknowledge that UTMB has demonstrated problems in recent history, but also there's been this, it should be acknowledged, open-mindedness to fixing those issues and proof in the pudding that, they're willing to make concessions, make changes. So that's great. I think that's something to be applauded. I think when you look at, and there's still work to be done. So there's still, I'm sure there are people listening to this that will say, Finn, you're neglecting this issue, and they are still unresolved. I totally grant them that. There are still many things that I took issue with. One of them, my dear friend, Corinne Malcolm, who was one of the announcers at UTMB for a long time. She's taken some pretty courageous stands around making sure that there is, at least from a camera standpoint, but also commentary standpoint, equal coverage of the men's and women's races. And, we can debate why she was let go. It's hard for me to believe that a portion of it was not because of her public stands in these areas. So there's still issues. When you go to UTMB Whistler, it's interesting. I am now a race director myself. We're putting on a race called the Twisted Fork Trail Festival in Park City next June 14th. That is a shameless plug, but I mention that race just to say that I am now a race director and I have a much better understanding in December of 24 than I did in December of 23 about the intricacies of permitting, relationship building, cooperation between various entities. One of the biggest things that I have learned in getting permits secured for Park City, and Park City is interesting because you have government entities, you have private entities, you've got ski resorts, you've got multinational corporations. You are trying to get permits operating across multiple stakeholders with different priorities. Some care deeply about the environment. Some care deeply about making sure that there is business at their area at a particular time of year, shoulder season, off season, summer, whatever. And so you're balancing a lot of different priorities. And I can see how in Whistler, a scenario could have arose where, who knows, maybe it actually was Vail Whistler that is to blame. Maybe it's UTMB that is to blame. But all I can say with confidence is the permitting process is super messy. I feel deeply for Gary because, in my opinion, he was sort of the incumbent race director. He was building something special. And there were really, let's call them microaggressions, if they were those at all, that issues that he created with the local permitting agencies that easily could have been fixed. And I think that him and his team were willing to go through a lot of hoops. It did seem to me like he was being forced out, which is a huge bummer. And I really don't know where to point the blame. But I will say, and again, I'm kind of being vague here, sometimes it can come down to the permitting agencies, and there's a lot of craziness that goes on there and balancing priorities that can make the answer here kind of muddled. Having talked with Paul Huddle at UTMB and interacting with Keats over email, I think it's also important to remember, at least on the UTMB side, that these people are in the sport not because they're trying to strike it rich. They're in the sport because they actually just love the endurance arena. They love trail running. They're fascinated about it. They want to spread the gospel of it. I can say that with absolute certainty for Paul, having had him on the podcast. If you look at his resume dating back to the triathlon scene, he is in it for the long haul. He's one of those people that I mentioned. He is put himself squarely in the evolutionary chain of endurance sports, and he's doing his best in the current era. And, they're only trying to grow through legal means. They're approaching race directors and they're saying, hey, we'd love to buy your race. Do you want to partner together? And some say yes, and some say no. And for the most part, maybe the Whistler one is sort of the most egregious counterexample. For the most part, if they can't find a partner in a given area, they look elsewhere first. They try to find green open spaces. So I don't really see it as predatorily as I used to. I also genuinely think that competition is good. And as long as you're not engaging in these Gary Robbins type scenarios where when the dust has settled, someone has been kicked out kind of unjustly, I genuinely think competition is good. And if UTMB is putting out a good product, that actually only helps other race directors who are inspired to kind of level up their own game, and the consumer wins. So I said a lot there, but those are my current feelings in December of 24.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that totally. Yeah, it's they've brought a couple of races in the UK, so the Arc of Attrition, which is a legendary winter race, which is a really tough winter race, and they've taken over that. And there was a lot of hoo-ha about that, about whether they should have done that. But at the end of the day, I listened to interviews with the original race directors, and they just said, it's just for them, it felt like the natural progression of the race, that it was getting a reputation, it was getting too big for them to handle. They had a small team that couldn't really cope with the race as it was. So they felt like it was a blessing that UTMB came in and took over their race. So, but people will still have their opinions, won't they? So you can't please everybody all of the time, can you, with decisions, and people have choices. I think it was Ellie Greenwood who sort of said, vote with your dollars. So basically you can go to a UTMB race, or you can go to one of your local races. So, you could be an ultra runner that only does local races, and you can get joy from that. Or you can go on a quest to go and travel the world and do these amazing blockbuster, race, bucket list races. And they're the choices that you've got, and you spend your money how you wish to spend your money, don't you?
Right. Yep.
Yeah. Right. I'll stop talking about UTMB now. We'll move on. We'll move on to a question that I've got for you.
Hey, I'm down to talk about whatever. I'm down to talk about whatever.
I know you are. So you mentioned your race. I wanted to talk about that Twisted Fork. So is this something that I listened to was it your last podcast that you put out where you spoke about sort of the announcement that you were sort of taking over that race? So is that something that you mentioned, that it was a race that you were asking whether it was if it was coming back? So was it not sort of a viable thing, and then you're reviving it? Is that the impression that I got? Did I get that right?
Yeah, so there it existed in a slightly scaled down form from 2018 to 2021. It was put on by this guy Canis Hart, who really just a great local contributor to the Park City scene. He actually for a while at the same time had a running store, trail running focused, called Park City Running Company. Amazing spot. When you think about what an ideal brick and mortar running location looks like, he had coffee and tea, he had couches, and it was one of those places where you walked in and not only did you go there to purchase gear, but you were encouraged to just hang out. And they did group runs from the store. And anyways, the race that he put on, the Twisted Fork 64K, it was sort of an extension of the store's personality. And he ended up closing the store shortly after COVID, and then he closed the race down after COVID as well. And I had run the race in 2019, had an absolute blast, and I had been pestering him year after year. When's it coming back? When's it coming back? This year he finally said, why don't you take it over? And my wife and I kind of conferenced, and we thought it was a great idea. And so, yeah, we've added our own touch to it in the sense that we're adding a couple shorter distances that we think are equally aesthetic. We have a couple initiatives that we're working on, the primary one being childcare, but we also want to add prize money to it and a live stream and modernize it to that extent. And yeah, we're excited about it. I mean, if you look at least on the, and again, this is something maybe we talk about comparing the UK scene to the American scene, but one of the trends that I'm really pleased with on the American scene is the advent of these festival type environments, Mammoth Trail Fest being one, Coccodona being another. If you want to lump together Broken Arrow, TrailCon in Western states, that's another, where basically you go to this area for a 4 to 7 day stretch. And yeah, you're there to do one of the races, but there's also these amazing networking and social opportunities. They're putting on movies, they're putting on group runs, there's gear expos, there's podcast conversations taking place, and then you have all this extra time to explore the area. With Twisted Fork, we do want to go in that direction. So in year one, or our version of year one, it'll be a single day event, June 14th. But we would love to get to a point in year 2 and beyond where we're stretching that out over, let's call it 3 or 4 days, and setting people up to really soak in the Park City scene. Because this is, the Olympics were here in 2002. It's a resort economy. We have an international airport that's 20 minutes away. The Wasatch Mountains are incredible. The course is runnable, but it's at altitude, so it's challenging in its own rights. There's just a lot of cool things, and we want to have the opportunity to build that out and kind of showcase it. So yeah, I'm happy to talk more about it, but that was the original impetus and kind of our inspiration and where we want to take it in the future.
Yeah, I think in the UK we there is like Love Trails Festival, which is like a festival, trail running festival over a weekend, but it's not associated with like a major race. It's just like a running festival, trail running festival, but it's kind of like, it was the first of its kind of type. There's the Kendall Mountain Festival. So in the Lake District, there is like a weekend of events. So there'll be races on, but there's no like sort of top tier race that is happening, and then the festival is around that. It's kind of like an event that's happening over a weekend, with different things going on, like live speakers and discussion panels and things like that. So it's similar, but it's not around a big race. But you have like, so, I look at like Javelina and see that's like basically like a festival in the desert, isn't it? Like that kind of vibe. So, I came over for Western States in 2022. I came over, and if you listen to a few of my podcasts, eventually I'll end up talking about Western States at one point or another, because I absolutely love that race so much. It like kind of, from my beginnings of getting into ultra running and reading like Dean Karnazes' book, it all leads up to Western States and everything. So for me, that was like the race that sort of stood out. I came over and sort of felt the vibe of that race. I was running a camera for the media team from Roby Point down to the finish. So I ran in like the top 10 men, the top 10 women, and it's like an experience that I will treasure that memory forever. It's like absolutely amazing. I came back for Golden Hour and ran everyone in for Golden Hour as well. And if I never go back to the race, I've got that memory. It's like a perfect little memory that I'll keep. But I couldn't sort of get over the fact that everybody's so excited about that race. Everybody, all the people are out from the houses surrounding at Roby Point and going into Auburn. Everyone absolutely gets on board with that race, and it's like a festival vibe. Are all your races like that? Because I sort of have that impression now that all of the big US like ultras are all that kind of festival kind of vibe. And when I see like Javelina and the partying going on and stuff, is it like that, or am I just sort of imagining that?
One of the central challenges for US-based races is a lot of our areas for hosting races are quite remote. And then on top of that, we are limited bureaucratically by the Forest Service. So, a lot of these places you can't permit more than, in some cases, 100 runners, 300 runners. So there's some artificial constraints around how big we can make these things. A lot of these festival formats, the reason they're able to go on, you think of a place like Mammoth Trail Fest. Mammoth Trail Fest is able to do that because a lot of that race takes place on a ski resort, which takes a much more liberal stance around permitting. Javelina, I believe, that's not a ski resort, but there's just different permitting opportunities there. The festival piece of it, yeah, it's a good question. Like, why is there always a party? Why is there so much fanfare when in most of the U.S., at most U.S. races, there's a sense of remoteness and really being out in the wilderness? I don't know. And I think probably the answer that comes to mind for me is you look at someone like Jamil Curry, who inherited the Javelina 100, he purchased the Javelina 100 way back in, it would have been like maybe 08, 09, 10. He was carrying on a tradition where that was just a Halloween thing. Like the previous race director had just decided that this was going to be a Halloween themed thing. People were going to get wild. They were going to dress up. There was going to be candy, whatever, beer, whatever. And I think because Jamil is just so influential, because he does such great work, and he's sort of, similar to Dylan, just somebody that people want to emulate, they looked at what was happening at Javelina and they imported a lot of those features. I think it's really human nature for us to see an example that resonates and then to want to try to copy a lot of those elements. And I think, we're probably in that era of American ultra trail running where the fad of the day is this kind of wild party that's taking place, or just the festival format in general. And maybe things change 10 years from now as, consumer preferences are different, and maybe the hot item of the day is this super scaled back experience. Because I know for a long time I was going to Europe. I was going to Chamonix because I wanted that Hollywood type, super built up, super produced experience that I wasn't getting in the US. But yeah, to your point, now we're getting a lot of that here too. And maybe that's just a function of Americans having gone over to Europe and seeing how festive these things are and how built up and professional they are, and wanted to bring that back. I know that was top of mind for Tim Tollefson at Mammoth. So I know I said a lot there. We have a lot of weird constraints around land usage. We don't have a similar compressed landscape like Europe where these like cities and towns are melded right into the mountain ranges. But we are still inspired. And so that's, I think, the Jamil example is one. And then the convergence with UTMB is another for, I think, why we're seeing what we're seeing now play out.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, I want to come back this next summer. I want to come out to. So I'm friends with a photographer over here, David Miller, he.
Oh, I know David. I met him at Barclay last year.
Yeah, David. He's
a great guy.
I'm probably like revealing information he probably doesn't want me to reveal. He possibly will be out in the US in the summer at some point for a couple of races. I won't say which ones if he's not if you don't want me to say. But I'm planning on being
certainly not Hard Rock. He's probably not going to get Hard Rock. Nothing. Yeah.
So I'll probably it's my goal to get back out there and do some filming because so I've got one of my little side hustles is I've got like a mini documentary series that I've started called Home Trails. So I've only done 2 episodes so far, and it's basically the premise of it is I go and interview. So other than like the standard podcast interview, it's an in-person interview where we sit down and have an in-depth conversation, but also the questions that I ask when they're sat down, we also beforehand have gone for a run together, and I will use a GoPro and film them and have the same conversation with them while we're running. So the set of questions will apply to both scenarios of on the trail and at home. And then afterwards I kind of edit them together so they're like one continuous conversation, so it seems like you're going backwards and forwards between the trail and sitting down standard conversation. So I've done one with Jasmine Paris, so we talked about Barclay and everything, and the second one that I did was with Jack Scott. So if you've heard of Jack Scott, he was the guy that
I know he's racing Coccodona. He's racing Coccodona next year.
Is he really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, and he won the spine.
Yes, he won the spine. Yeah, I didn't know he was going to Coccodona. Wow, that's interesting. And that is
Yep. Yep.
that's news. Yeah. Oh, I'm glad you've told me that. So I'll be seeing him at the spine in January. So that I'm going back to do media work. So I'm going to be running around with a camera doing doing bits and bobs of media. So
Very cool.
yeah. So
Yeah. I was gonna say it reminds me, and again, I think I watched the one with Jasmine, but there was a series that Billy Yang did. Gosh, it would have probably been like 7 or 8 years ago, and it was called 15 Hours.
yes,
And he
yeah.
went and hung out with Anton
Mm,
Krupicka and Amelia Boone and Magda Boulay, et cetera,
mm,
et cetera, et cetera. And it was just this cool snapshot, like that he would extract a piece of the conversation and then layer really cool B-roll
mm,
over it. And it sounds
yeah.
directionally like you could be creating a version of that, which is super cool because I miss those dearly.
Yeah. That's the idea. Something a little bit because a little bit different because there's a lot of stuff on YouTube in there that is all pretty much samey, and there's some brilliant stuff on there, amazing stuff. But I just thought I want to do something that is in my wheelhouse, which is interviewing people, but also I want the outdoor aspect of like long form conversations, but it be actually on the trail and do something a bit different because everyone can do a conversation where you sit down and you talk to each other, but having a conversation while you're running is a bit different as well. So what the point I was getting to, and I forgot what I was saying, was that I'm planning to come out to what I want to do is come out to the US and do a US version as well at some point. So either this coming summer or the summer after. Um, so I've sort of messaged a few people already to try and see who I could sort of get involved, and hopefully David Roach will keep his promise that I can sort of come and do an episode of Home Trails with him. That would be great. And if I could get out this year, that would be even better because I could get in before he goes to Western States, and that would make a great ending to the video of him winning Western States.
Yeah. Cool, cool, cool.
Well, we're talking about running then. Tell me about your running. So you're doing Coccodona, aren't you, next year?
Yeah, so things are in flux a little bit. The commitments that I can say publicly are I'm going to go out to the Canary Islands in
Oh,
February. I'm going to do the Trans Gran Canaria Classic, the
yeah.
126-kilometer race, and then I'll be heading back to Coccodona in May. And then I mentioned it earlier. I love the Appalachian Trail, which is for those that aren't familiar in the UK, runs from northern Georgia to it's called Springer Mountain in northern Georgia to Mount Katahdin in northwestern Maine on the eastern seaboard of the U.S. Amazing trail. I'm going to go back in August to do a section right before Mount Katahdin called the 100-mile Wilderness, which is the last section before the northern terminus. And it's famous for being incredibly remote.
Mm,
So no real access to roads or highways, anything like that. Like you're really out there. There's some logging roads, pretty remote rugged logging roads that you can kind of intersect the trail with, but otherwise rugged. I love it. So those are the three things that are like for sure on my
mm,
list. And I'm still looking for another multi-day race to do, whether it's like a Moab
mm,
240, something I can't talk about that I might have heard about. I kind of have to be hush
yeah.
hush. Also, I mean, it wouldn't be for this year, but I would love to do the spine one day. I tried to get in this past year and it was sold
Oh
out, and I
yeah.
was super bummed
Instantly. Yeah.
because I have family. I have family in Manchester. I have
Wow.
family in the Haringey neighborhood of North London. Like I'm there all the
Wow.
time. We typically go in January, and so I have to figure out how to get into this dang race because I think the spine is so cool.
Okay.
I love that you cover it and you're so involved. That's a dream one
Yeah.
day. But yeah, those three races: Coccodona, Trans Gran Canaria, 100-mile Wilderness. Those are my three for next year so far.
I can give you offline. I can give you some tips on how to get into the spine.
Awesome, because that I mean, I would. It's like I would love to do it, and I mean, gosh, like you guys have such cool races. The Dragon's
Yeah.
Back. I want to do that one day. Snowdonia looks amazing. You mentioned Arc of Attrition. What's the World Trail Majors race that's over there too? Isn't there a World Trail Majors race?
Yeah. What is it?
I'll
One
pull
of
it up.
the Centurion races. So is it like the North Downs way? or South Downs Way.
Yep. South Downs Way.
South Downs Way, yeah.
Okay.
Centurion running there. They sort of styled themselves on sort of US big 100-milers. So then that's their sort of goal, to sort of be like, like the Western States kind of, that kind of vibe. That's what they're looking for. So they've got going back many years, they've been putting on 100-milers. They were probably one of the first like major race directing companies that put on big 100-milers. So yeah, they're iconic in the UK. But what appeals to you about the Spine? Because I've ran on when I was in the States, and going to Canada and stuff, I've ran on some trails, and a lot of the trails I ran on were sort of like fire roads and fairly like well maintained trails. What appeals to you about the Spine race? Because a lot of that is like knee deep in bogs.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're talking about ancestry, I have Northern European roots, UK, Ireland, etc. And when I think about my preferences for running, I always find myself enjoying inclement weather on the colder side, as well as kind of rugged conditions. I like the idea of just surviving. Yeah. And every time I've seen the Spine on display, there's sort of this stoic aspect to it, and this survival aspect. And yeah, sure, you need to have some talent to be competitive at it, but I love the fact that it also just rewards toughness and resilience and the necessity to have a very strong why. And I also think, I mean, here in the US, one of the people that I admire deeply is John Kelly. So John Kelly has history there, and same thing with the Pennine Way.
We've adopted it. Like him, he's almost like he's an adopted Englishman, isn't he, John Kelly?
Yeah. And then obviously, what Jasmine did there was just amazing. I'm a big Damian Hall fan. Got to meet him at Barkley last year. And so I think I appreciate the character of the people that represent that race. Like those are just athletes in general that I admire. And I think when you admire someone, you kind of want to find a way to sync with sort of their activities. And so right now I'm really high on the multi-day stuff. And would it be fair to say that the Spine is sort of the crown jewel of multi-day racing in the UK?
Yeah,
or
definitely. Yeah, it is. It's got a reputation. It is the race that is known outside of ultra running. So it's the race that is always on daytime TV and on the news. So when it's on, there's reporters there, like sort of doing news reports to the normal people in the world know that it's going on and they're aware of it. But things like the Dragon's Back and Race Across Scotland, those sort of races in the Arc of Attrition, they attract a lot of attention, but it's mainly from the trail running world, whereas the Spine sort of transcends that divide. And people are over. And it's got such a reputation for being, I was terrified of it for years. So I had a friend who had attempted, because they split the race up into, you can do like the sprint, which is like the first 46 miles, which is bad enough. But I love that section. Or you can do this Challenger South, which is the first 106 miles. And then you can do the top section, which is Challenger North, and that's 160 miles. Or you can do the whole thing, which is 268 miles. So I had a friend who, was a sort of a long-term running friend, and he was obsessed with sort of doing the Spine, but he's attempted it 2 or 3 times and not made it to the finish. And so I sort of built up this kind of thing in my head that it was, I love the race, but I would never be in a position to be able to do it until I started to volunteer for the race and go. And so I went and worked on one of the checkpoints for the first year, and then I went back and worked on the media team, and I realised that the people that were doing it they're just normal people. They're like, you kind of sort of think that they're like superhumans and that I could never do that race. But then when you see them, you realise that they're just, they are just normal people that are grinding it out in a race that is rewards stubbornness, and the conditions can be brutal, and it's billed as Britain's most brutal race. And it can be like the most unforgiving weather and conditions and terrain. Like this year when I did it in January, I slipped off a stone wall at like 5 o'clock in the morning and hit my head on the frozen ground, knocked myself out. I had I landed on my hip and got a massive hematoma on my hip bone, and I still managed to finish the race. The medics wanted to put me out of the race, but I was, insistent that I'd be seen by the top doctor on the race, and she came to see me. And after 8 hours of being basically just not going anywhere, she agreed that I was okay to carry on. But I think that race I'm obsessed with it. A lot of people are obsessed with it, probably as much as people are obsessed with Western States. Basically, the Spine is a completely different race to that, but I think the level of obsession is the same in the UK for the Spine as it is for like races like Western States.
Yeah, we had one. We had a guy here in Park City. His name's Dominic Layfield. He in 2017 ran the 100-miler there, and he won. It was the same year that Tom Hollins won the longer race. And I think Tom actually went and tried to do Barkley like last year. So yeah, that was another thing too. Just like thinking about inspirations, motivations. I remember he went out in 2017.
Barkley seems like a British race to me. It feels, I know it's not, but it seems like the Brits have like traditionally done quite well because we're used to those horrible conditions and the terrain.
Right. Yeah, but you got to come out for that too if you get a chance. I mean, if you're going to make this tour, I think Laz would be a great person to check in.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Maybe a Home Trails episode with Laz. Yeah, excellent. Well, and I'm aware of keeping you for too much time. What, just sort of finally then, what do you? Where, I'm not going to say where do you see yourself in 5 years. What's the plan for Sigletrack? How do you view the next few years? What do you want to do? What do you not want to do? What do you want it to become? Are you happy with the way things are if it stayed the same, or have you got like a bit of an end game or a goal that you're working towards?
Well, we just had our first kid, who was born September 30th. She's now 2.5 months old. And one of the things that I reflect back on, I know I said at the beginning of the show that I had a lot of freedom as a kid, but one thing I remember that I was really grateful for was my parents were pretty supportive and attentive, and they, even though they had careers, they were always looking to show up for our sporting events and to help us, see our hobbies through and just grow up. And so being in business, I think you can go down this dangerous path where you become a workaholic and you just are driven by the profit motive, or you can't separate family life from business life. And I really want to be conscious of that, I would say, in the next 2 or 3 years, where I do want to like step back a little bit in terms of intensity and make sure I can be there and be a great parent first, because I just think like, the older I get, the more I realize I want to be really accountable to my family, but and then after that, I want to be really accountable to my local community, and then maybe nationally and internationally as far as trail running goes, because it's such a small community. Sure, you could dabble a little bit there, but I think if I had to guess what we're doing more of in the next few years, I don't think anything fundamentally changes about the podcast or what we're doing on YouTube, but I would say what is going to be improving is our local presence and our local impact here in the Salt Lake City, Park City area. So I hope when the dust has settled, we have built a reputation as being really generous and charitable and resourceful to our local scene. That I have a feeling that that's going to resonate even more, because I don't know how you feel, because I know that a lot of your episodes, I mean, yes, you do niche into the UK scene, but even so, UK is huge. There's a lot of people there. There's a big trail scene. And then you do have a lot of international podcasts, it feels good to have those conversations, but a lot of like the warm and fuzzies that I get are when I can do some cool stuff as close to home as possible. So that's what I'm feeling right now.
Yeah, being a dad changes you, doesn't it? Fundamentally, I know. Yeah.
You're a dad too, right?
See, I've got two girls. I've got two teenage girls. 14 and 13. And I think so. We had kids quite well. I was later in life for me. I was 30, so I got to 30, and I suddenly turned to my wife and said, "Okay, I'm ready to have kids now. I feel like I'm an adult now. I can have kids." And she was only 23 because she's younger than me, and she was like, "Yeah, okay, yeah." So we just sort of made a decision on the spot that we were going to have kids. And I had a bit of like quite a wayward teenage years, and in my 20s I was quite wild.
Sure.
So having kids kind of like put my mind into a bit of focus. It made me realise, I think having kids sometimes makes you realise that you wasted a bit of time in life as well, sort of thing. You realise how much time you didn't really do a lot with when time becomes precious when you've got kids. So I suppose you'll find that as yours gets older, that it made me more motivated in life to sort of do things with my life and do meaningful things. So all of the sort of big decisions and things that I pursued in life I was kind of, before kids, I was kind of sort of like wandering through life a little bit, and then having kids kind of focused me. Do you feel like was it too early to say, sort of only with like a 3-month-old?
Oh my gosh, no, spot on. In fact, I found the name for it the other day. It's called Cunningham's Law, which basically says the amount of time it takes to do something is almost directly proportional to how much time you give it. Obviously, there are some constraints, like some things baseline take, let's call it 2 hours. But if you give yourself 8 hours to edit a podcast, it's going to take 8 hours. If you give yourself 4 hours, it's going to probably take 4 hours. And having kids, as you've described, I thought I wasn't going to have enough time to do a lot of these things. But what I really found out was, yeah, time is precious, time is tight. But I also, like you said, was not really being that efficient with my time to begin with. So now that I have been forced to become more mindful and efficient, I don't actually lament the time that I had before.
Yeah, it's great. I absolutely love being a dad. It's rewarding, but as they get older, it gets challenging now that they're in the teenage years. Different problems, but yeah, I wouldn't have it any other way. Yeah, I love them to bits. Right.
Also, I just looked it up, and it is not Cunningham's Law. That is a totally different thing. I'm actually going to tell you what Cunningham's Law is, because people should know that I had to look this up. The Cunningham's Law is, quote, the best way to get the right answer on the internet is not to ask a question, it's to post the wrong answer. Okay, so I was thinking of something totally different, which that is still interesting. That's still a very interesting law.
That is very true. Yeah.
And it's also true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you get told within seconds that you're wrong. Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Well,
we have been victims to Cunningham's Law many times.
Yeah, definitely. Podcast. Yeah, I have as well. Well, Finn, I really appreciate you coming on and getting this set up for us, because I view it as a privilege to sort of speak to you, because I know what I do. I feel like I would like to think that I kind of mirror what you do in the US, in the UK, to a sort of lower degree. I'm not as notorious as you in the media space, but what you're trying to achieve and what you are achieving over there is what I sort of look up to. That's the kind of coverage I want to give to UK trail running and ultra running. So I appreciate everything that you sort of do for the space, and keep doing it, because I love listening to your podcast, and like I said, I've always been obsessed with US trail and ultra running, so I appreciate what you do, and I appreciate being able to listen to it.
Oh yeah, and I'll just add one last thing before we go. I really appreciate the work you do, and I think it's such a big sport that if there's one wish that I had for the trajectory of media is that there is some more, let's call it unbundling that goes on. And people like you and me are able to really focus and specialize in particular niches. Like I even think the UK, like I said, the UK scene is huge. Like you have a massive undertaking just covering the UK scene. For me to think about the North American scene and UTMB and Western, that's massive. Like I would love to get to a point where it's like we have these local outlets and maybe I get to actually scale back and I'm just focusing on the Mountain West, like, Colorado and Utah and Arizona here in the US. Like that's kind of a far-fetched dream I have. But yeah, all that to say, I really appreciate the work you do. I'm grateful for the time and looking forward to hopefully making some new friends in the UK after this one.
Yeah. That was, I thought that was sort of one of the things I wanted to achieve from this as well, was that I introduce, because I speak to my audience, and I speak to people about people in the US trail running sort of scene, and some of them know who they are, and some go, I don't know who that is. So one of the things I try and do with my podcast is sort of introduce people that I'm excited about, from across the pond, so that people can sort of then, go and see what you guys are doing, and maybe someone will pick up my podcast, by searching for your name, hopefully.